organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it. Work for it, strive for it, I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the Money, Power, Land Solidarity podcast. We are really excited today to have a special guest with us who's going to be talking about some issues that are very active and very urgent for folks in Minneapolis and across the country. So I want to welcome Kahaa. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, can you start just by introducing yourself to our listeners and talk about how you became involved in the fight to protect public housing?
Yeah, so my name is Kahaa. I'm a sophomore at the University of Minnesota. I'm 19, and I'm an artist and organizer, so I write stuff and I try and perform stuff, and I also do public housing advocacy. I got involved with public housing and with Defend Glendale and Public Housing Coalition because my mom founded the campaign, and because I'm also a lifelong public housing resident. When I was in high school, I needed a volunteer hour, so I just checked out what my mom was doing, and then I started door knocking and I started volunteering at meetings, and I was like, oh my God, this is super interesting and also scary and also very important. And so I sort of got really interested in housing from that point, and since then I've just been doing it. So almost 5 years now I've been working with Defend Glendale.
Wow. Could you talk a bit about how and why Defend Glendale was formed? Like, what were maybe give folks a context of what the Glendale townhomes are, and then what were the issues that sparked the Defend Glendale campaign into existence?
Yeah, so Glendale townhomes are 184 family units in southeast Minneapolis in the Prospect Park neighborhood. It's actually sort of the last, I don't like to use the word project, but it's the last public housing project in the city of Minneapolis. During the 90s, there used to be a lot more, but then they were all demolished. And so with the Glendale, what happened was in 2014, my mom, who co-founded the campaign, was door knocking, doing Get Out the Vote in Prospect Park, and one of the homeowners said, hey, you shouldn't be worried about this election, you should be worried about what's happening to your homes. And my mom was like, what? What are you talking about? So she called Cam Gordon, our city councilor, and he's still our city councilor, and he was like, oh, I'm sorry you had to find out this way. So what happened was MPHA, Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, had been meeting with homeowners in Prospect Park to see how they would prefer Glendale townhomes get privatized. But they hadn't met with any residents from Glendale. They hadn't gotten any input from residents, but they had been for months getting input from homeowners. And what they were planning to do at the time was a rental assistance demonstration demolition, or RAD. And so that's how my mom found out about MPHA's privatization schemes. And after that, she joined the Glendale Townhomes Council, the Resident Council, because most people don't know this, but all public housing buildings or projects have councils so that residents can share their voices, can advocate for each other, can communicate with the public housing authority. Public housing authorities all over the country get funding from HUD specifically to do these councils. And so my mom joined the council, which had been sort of defunct at that point, and she and other residents who co-founded the campaign joined the council to try and get answers from MPHA, from the Public Housing Authority, but MPHA wasn't really responding to them. They weren't really sharing resources like they were supposed to. They were kind of shutting them out. And so during one day, during one of the meetings, the entire resident council, all of the residents quit and said, we're done with this. We're not getting the help that we need through this resident council, we're just gonna quit. And from then on, Defend Glendale was started. And the name Defend Glendale came from when they were having meetings, MPHA would try to come to the meetings to see what they were planning, what organizing they were doing, what actions they were planning to do, and the residents said, if you're not defending Glendale, then you can't come into the meeting. If you're interested in privatization, we have nothing to talk about.
Wow.
So that's how Defend Glendale got started, and then since then we changed our name to Defend Glendale and Public Housing Coalition, because in 2017, when Greg Arrest became the executive director of Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, he decided not just to privatize Glendale townhomes, but to privatize all of the public housing in the city of Minneapolis. And so we started a coalition with not just Glendale residents, but with residents from all over the city.
Wow. So that was 2014, you said, when
we first started.
Yeah. And just to give folks a context, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is the Glendale townhomes sit kind of as an enclave inside of a neighborhood where most of the homeowners are wealthier and whiter. So the idea that the MPHA was informing the white wealthy homeowners about the future of these townhomes and not speaking to the residents in 2014, and that sparked this organizing. You talked a bit about RAD, and under the Obama administration, HUD Secretary Julian Castro really started to move this controversial program called RAD to privatize public housing. And now under the Trump administration, HUD Secretary Ben Carson has really expanded the program and loosened restrictions. Can you talk a bit about what RAD is and give us kind of an overview of that program?
So I think first it's important to note that RAD isn't like the first of its kind. RAD is sort of the legacy of Hope 6, which was a program used to demolish public housing in the 90s. And Hope 6 operated really similarly to RAD, how RAD works today. I'm pretty sure that Hope 6 was used with Heritage Park
I think so.
in North Minneapolis. And so Hope 6 was used in the 90s, and RAD is sort of like the child of Hope 6. And the way RAD works is typically, it's sort of like a double handout. So private investors will get transferred the property for free, and this is in exchange for, it's not like, how do I say this? The property is, the actual building is transferred, but the land itself gets a free lease for about 30 to 100 years, depending on the contract. And then in exchange with this sort of free land and this free building, I'm not explaining this well.
No,
so
I'm with you.
In exchange for this free land and this free building, the new investors, the new property owners will also get government subsidies for decades to come in exchange for setting aside a certain percentage of the units as Section 8. So it's sort of like a double handout. You get free land, a free building, and you get subsidies to come in exchange for setting aside 20 to 30% of the units as Section 8. And this is totally weird, right? Because, for example, you take Elliott Twins, which is going through a RAD conversion currently, 100% of those units are public housing, which means 100% of those units are 30% of your income or minimum rent, right? And then you're going to take 100% and turn it into 20% of Section 8. Section 8 is also more expensive than public housing. So it's a really messed up program because you're giving all this free money, so much free money to private investors, and not only are you giving free money to private investors, you're actually reducing the amount of affordable housing that's in the city. So that's the way that RAD typically works, and that's the way that they plan on making RAD work in the city of Minneapolis.
And can you talk a bit about, you already talked about the devious way RAD was rolled out at Glendale. Can you talk about how it's been pushed since then, and kind of what has been the response from public housing residents who are, when they become aware of this RAD scheme? Yeah, so it's not just that RAD reduces the amount of public affordable housing and gets rid of units that you live in, but it's also that residents' rights aren't really enforced with RAD. The GOA did a report in 2018, I believe, the General Office of Accounting, and they said that HUD should stop using RAD totally until they can really do an overhaul of the program and enforce residents' rights, because all over the country residents have been promised that they'd have the right to return to their homes, and that's never been enforced. Ed Getz, who's a professor here at the U, said that typically only 1 in 5 residents move back after RAD conversion, which is horrible. That means that 20% of people are actually rehoused after this happens, so everybody's basically becoming homeless. And so when residents find this out, they usually want to organize. So the only building that has truly gone through RAD so far has been Elliott Twins, and since 2017, Elliott Twins residents have been organizing to try and stop that conversion. The thing is, Elliott Twins is a building. It's a senior building. It's a building designated for seniors and disabled folks. So the capacity for some of these older folks to organize long term was just wearing on people. So at the beginning of this year, they just decided during March, May of this year, they decided, you know what, we're just going to step back. What happens happens. We're going to let it go with God. And you know what, we had to support that. I think a misconception about our campaign is that we push residents, or that we confuse residents and misconstrue information and push them to organizing, and we don't do that. What we do as a campaign is we go to
different residents in each of these buildings, and we say, hey, this is what MPHA has proposed to happen to your building, because MPHA intentionally misconstrues the information. And then we say, if you want help organizing, we will support you. If you want to just chill, we'll support you in that too. So residents told us at the campaign earlier this year, they were like, we don't want to organize anymore. We're just going to let what happens, because we've been organizing for 2 years already and nothing's happened.
Yeah.
So, so Elliott Twins is going through with RAD.
Wow.
RAD is going through at Elliott Twins later this year in 2020.
And I got to say that I have so much respect for the Defend Glendale campaign, especially the function of journalism and information sharing in terms of like, most folks wouldn't know any of this is happening. You talk about the way that they did it at Glendale and the way that they've tried to move these schemes, where it's a complete public relations campaign that hides the reality. And if it wasn't for the hard work that you all are doing while you're living through attacks on your own home, it's like, it's really impressive. And I know that it's hard. I can't even imagine the stress that it causes and the effort that has to go into it.
Speaking of public relations, this is just like a fun fact. It's not a fun fact, but Greg Russ used to work at this like military contracting firm that did work with the CIA in the 90s, and that firm like really did a lot of public relations work, especially around the coups in Chile. So like Greg Russ, who became the executive director of Minneapolis Public Housing Authority in 2017, and actually has since left to go work at NYCHA, New York City Public Housing. His expertise is in misconstruing information and propaganda and confusing the masses. And so the biggest part of our campaign is really letting people know, like, this is what's happening, this is what's going on. Because what MPHA does is they send out flyers in different languages and they just say, hey, we're having a meeting. They don't follow up with anybody. So like lots of residents can't read, some residents don't understand the information that's being given to them. So we just go and we like make the information accessible to them, and we say, what do you want to do next?
Can you talk a little bit more about Greg Russ? I didn't know that dynamic of his history, but even what I knew was scary. Can you talk about his history with the privatization of public housing and kind of what he was doing before he came to Minneapolis, and then what agenda he pursued when he was the head of public housing in Minneapolis?
Yeah, so I think to really understand Greg Russ, you have to understand that like he once testified in front of Congress and said that public housing needs to be privatized, like this is the way to go, and that he considers it a calling to privatize public housing. So like that's sort of his ideological mission. But yeah, Greg Russ worked for Apt Associates in the 90s, which was a contractor, like I said earlier, for the CIA. But outside of that, he has privatized public housing in 4 cities. One of the most notable things that he did was he led the privatization of Cabrini Green in the 90s as a HUD official, and most people know Cabrini Green. A lot of people actually that live in Minneapolis came to Minneapolis from living in Cabrini Green. But he also got rid of a lot of public housing in Detroit in the 90s as a HUD official. He went to Philadelphia and was the second in command, the deputy director of Philadelphia Public Housing Authority, and he got rid of a lot of their public housing. And then before he came to Minneapolis, he got rid of all of Cambridge, Massachusetts public housing.
Wow.
And so, yeah, it's really important though to sort of recognize that like this is his history, this is his legacy, and it was well known that this is what he did before he came to Minneapolis. And the people that decide who the executive director of Minneapolis Public Housing Authority are is City Council. Lisa Goodman, City Council member, she personally brought him to interview for the job. So it's really important to be like, oh wow, this guy, he was the worst, but it wasn't him that came here. He's not the one who brought himself here. The city of Minneapolis did. So it was intentionally like planned by the city to privatize public housing.
And this is in the context of a gentrifying Minneapolis, where
Yes.
the economic ideology at City Hall is increase the property tax base, increase the quote-unquote value of the land, move poor people out, move rich people in. And this is just fits part and parcel. This is a huge piece of the gentrification of Minneapolis, is this attack on public housing. So my understanding is that Greg Russ now has been recruited to go do the same thing in New York City.
Yeah. I also just want to say one more thing about his work here, though. Greg Russ had a total, like, aside from like being the worst, right? He also had a total conflict of interest when he was working here in the Twin Cities. In the city of Minneapolis, what he did was his father-in-law has one of the biggest stakes in Kenneth Talley Thies and Talley, which is one of the biggest affordable housing like operators in the state of Minnesota. So at the time that he was working here, he was planning on privatizing public housing to sell off to investors like his father-in-law. So there was this massive conflict of interest that the city of Minneapolis knew about because we told them about it, but they never addressed. But yeah, he made $200,000 a year here, and then he got a bump to go to NYCHA, New York City Public Housing, and he's getting $400,000 there.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then can you talk a bit about the person who has been tapped to be the interim director since Greg Russ has left, Tracy Scott? What's her history and her ideological approach to public housing?
Yeah, so Tracy Scott was brought in by Greg Russ, so she comes from the same like ideology as he does, where privatization is good and we should be privatizing, you know. And she came from Atlanta, and if you know anything about Atlanta, Atlanta has no more public housing. Public housing in Atlanta is gone. So she was a part of Atlanta's Public Housing Authority, and she was one of the actors who made sure that like Atlanta had no more public housing. So like she's the current interim director. Right now they're doing a search for a new director. I'm not sure if she'll become the new director or if somebody else will, but we don't want her to be the new director because she has the same approach as Greg Russ.
I was actually in Atlanta a couple months ago meeting with folks from the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, which is a group that's working to prevent gentrification in Atlanta. And that privatization of public housing, you could still feel the trauma in the people I was meeting with. And we drove past so many sites where people pointed and said, that used to be public housing, that used to be public housing. And this was all in the context of a city that just completely gentrified. So it's like really scary to think Tracy Scott was brought here to do that.
Just to add on to that, when we talk about like Greg Russ in Philadelphia, I was leading a workshop once, and there was a woman who used to live in Philadelphia and who was a kid in Philadelphia when the privatization was happening. And she said that like the privatization of public housing, especially in North Philly, completely messed up all the schools. People had to move out, people had to switch schools, it messed up the community. And I think it's really important to note that like when we get rid of public housing, we're not really only getting rid of affordable housing where people only pay 30% of their income, but we're destroying communities.
Absolutely.
You know, so.
The idea that they say, I've been in some Glendale meetings and heard folks cynically say, folks are going to get Section 8 vouchers, but if you are a working class person, you know that the wait list for Section 8 is
Section 8 doesn't work.
Unbelievable. You're not going to get it for years, and when you get it, you're probably going to be way out in suburban Hennepin County that's 30 minutes away. It's just the level of callousness that people treat the violence that they're putting people through is just disgusting.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit, so beyond the RAD program, Greg Russ also moved, and Glendale has been raising awareness about the Section 18 demolition and disposition for scattered site public housing. Can you talk a bit about that program and the impact that would have on public housing in Minneapolis?
So again, Section 18 is a program that's been happening for decades. It's basically where if a public housing authority literally cannot afford to rehab a home that is in such bad disrepair, then they use Section 18 to demolish or dispose of it. So disposing means transferring ownership. And so this program, prior to Carson's HUD, had limits. You could only do a few houses a year. It had to be, you know, like very like regimented, and it had to go through a long approval process at HUD. But since Carson came in, he just stripped all the protections. So when Carson's HUD said, you know what, you can do whatever you want, Greg Russ said, yeah, I'm going to do whatever I want. So he applied for all 736 units of single-family homes to be privatized through this program. And then what happened was HUD ended up approving 717. So not all of the units, but basically like short of 20 units have been approved.
95% of scattered site public housing units.
To explain, scattered site public housing is single family homes. So there are 717 single family homes throughout the city of Minneapolis which have been approved for disposition, meaning that the ownership of these homes is going to be transferred. And then the way that this is going to work is kind of confusing for a lot of people, so I just want to break it down. Basically what will happen is MPHA will sell each of these units for $1 to a nonprofit that they created called CHR, Community Housing Resources. And so what they're telling people is because they sold it to a nonprofit that they created, it's still public housing. But the way that public housing works is if you sell it,
It's not public. Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So they're really confusing people. They're like, we're controlling this nonprofit, so you don't have anything to worry about. But that's not true. Like, one thing is, like, you can't hold a nonprofit accountable the same way that you can hold a public agency. You know what I mean?
Yes.
The other thing is that this nonprofit will have board control by private investors and developers, and that the way that the MPHA planned out this nonprofit structure is that it will only give them 0.001% of control over the nonprofit, and that 99.9% of the homes will be owned by private investors. So basically, these homes are being privatized, right? Essentially, but the way that they're doing it is confusing.
Yes.
So that they can sort of be like, yeah, we created this nonprofit. Yeah, but you're not the board, right? You don't own the majority of the shares of like the homes. Like, that's not the way that it works. So basically, what's going to happen after this is once the homes are privatized, the subsidy will change from public housing to Section 8. And to break it down, I don't want to get too far into it, but public housing, you only pay 30% of your income, period.
Fixed rate,
period. You know, or if you don't have any income, you pay minimum rate, okay? Period. The way that Section 8 works is you have something called fair market rate. I think I'm saying that right. So it's a fixed subsidy, you know what I mean? If I have a Section 8 voucher and you're my landlord and you raise my rent past the fair market rate, I either have to find a way to cover the difference or move, right? So when these private investors have 99.9% of control over these homes, they can decide to change the rent whenever they want, you know? So it makes no sense.
And that's absolutely the only reason a private investor would invest in these homes is because they want to pull rents from it. So their only impetus is to raise the rent. And this is happening in a context when these scattered site housing are sitting on land that's going to experience intense gentrification.
Exactly.
So if I'm not mistaken, a lot of them are over north, Harrison neighborhood.
So many homes are over north. I think between Willard Hayes near North and Harrison, there's like over 100. So the way that like North Minneapolis especially is going to look after this application goes through, it's ridiculous. I think it's also important to note that like residents are really being confused by MPHA, because when MPHA originally proposed these plans, they said, yo, your homes are going to be in such great shape. We're going to, because lots of scattered sites only have one bathroom. They said, we're going to add another bathroom. We're going to change it up. We're going to do more stuff, you know, and you're going to be able to stay in your home. You're going to pay the same rent. They didn't explain the subsidy change. They didn't explain the ownership change. And so residents who haven't been in communication with us don't really understand the scope of this program. It's really horrible.
Yeah. And the full name of it is Section 18 Demolition and Disposition. So are they also going to come in and rebuild, renovate, move people out of their homes to make these changes?
Yeah, the assumption is that they're going to do that after the disposition.
Okay.
Yeah, so after the ownership of the homes has been transferred, then that's what's going to happen. But at that point, it's out of our control. You know what I mean? I think that's also important to note for RAD too. RAD is disposition and demolition. The reason why we were able to stop RAD at Glendale is because when Cora McCorvey was still the director of MPHA, she decided to do demolition first instead of disposition. In order to demolish public property, you have to get city approval. So we were able to stop a vote at city council whether or not RAD should go through at Glendale Townhomes. But when Greg West came in, he was more smart about it. He was like, we're just going to transfer ownership first. We don't need city approval for this. And then you know, it'll be too late and then we can demolish it.
And that's really a killer move, because then when the ownership changes, all the rights that come with public housing and it being a public good are out of the window. So now your home is owned 99% by some capitalist investor who can move you around with no protections. That's a really savvy move on their part.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about the role of the city of Minneapolis, both in RAD and Section 18? You know, what power does the mayor and city council have in these matters, and how have they executed that power so far? Yeah,
so I think that, like, first I should say that lots of city council doesn't acknowledge that they have power. I think when we ask a lot of city council to stop this, something that they say often is that they lack the political capital, that there's not the will. There's no will within the city. And I think that's especially funny now because recently CD5, the Congressional District 5, DFL, passed a resolution saying that they wanted to protect public housing, and that they don't want the privatization of public housing. So now we have these council people that are saying, hey, we don't want this to happen, we don't have the will, but then their party is backing them up now, the DFL, you know what I mean? And now residents have been saying this for years.
Yeah.
So there's this like just literal lack of action, you know? But I think let's just get through this really quick because people don't understand. People think that MPHA is separate from the city, and that's not totally true. Minneapolis Public Housing Authority went through this program called Moving to Work in the 90s. And that sort of deregulates them, but that doesn't mean that they have no relationship with the city. MPHA is obligated to report quarterly to City Council, and they haven't been doing that for so many years. So there's not really a relationship between MPHA and the City Council at this point, but there should be.
Yeah.
The mayor and City Council have the authority under Chapter 420 to appoint, but also remove commissioners without cause. So if they said, hey, we don't like the way that Tracy Scott is running this, we could get rid of her. You know what I mean? That's totally within their power, but they're refusing to. And then the 1980 special law also dictates that the city can put limitations on MPHA by ordinance. So the city could literally just say, hey, we don't like what MPHA is doing. Ordinance, we're stopping all of this. But they're not. So the way that a lot of MPHA communicates it to residents and the way that the city communicates it to their like constituents is that there's like no relationship, so that nobody can be held accountable. But there actually is.
Yeah.
You know, and we know that there is because Greg Russ was brought in by City Council.
Absolutely.
So yeah, also in terms of Section 18, Lisa Bender and Mayor Jacob Fry both wrote letters of support for this application when it was still in the approval phase. And that's why when HUD actually approved the application, in their letter of approval, they said one of the reasons why we're supporting this application is because Jacob Fry wrote a letter of support. So Jacob Fry is in lots of ways responsible for this now, this Section 18 disposition. But he's not going to admit that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the city council will put their hands up and say, we don't have any power, when residents, I've been in multiple times, room full of public housing residents that you folks have brought together, and the city council acts like they can do nothing about it. But then they'll use their power to write a letter specifically to the Carson administration at HUD to aggressively lobby for Section 18. So feels like the privatization is really what they are after.
Exactly. We have people like Adi Warsama and Andrew Jenkins who ran during their elections and said we're going to protect public housing to their public housing residents. And then when they got into office, they wrote a resolution last year that supports conversion. You know, we have just a lot of like backtalk, like a lot of, you know.
Can you talk about, I'm really interested in this dynamic. You know, at first I saw AOC and Bernie Sanders put out a really aggressive plan to revitalize and restore the public housing that exists and invest in building more public housing. And then following up, Ilhan Omar, who represents Minneapolis, you know, made a big national splash by putting forward a bold proposal that called for massive investment in public housing and building new public housing. And you hear folks in Minneapolis voice support for that. They might tweet about it. How does that work? How do you support a plan like that, but then ignore the public housing residents in your own city? Do you have thoughts or feelings about that?
So it makes me mad, personally.
Me too.
But I think, I just want to say, I think Ilhan's like Home for All's Act is really cool. It seems like a really dope piece of legislation, generally speaking, right? That being said, as an organizer with Defend Glendale and Public Housing Coalition, we've been lobbying her since March of this year, well before this bill was announced, to write a letter against the privatization, because the way that this works, and a lot of people don't know this, is like Congress people determine HUD's budget, right? At the end of the day, when the budget bill passes, they're the people that you need, you know what I mean? So there have been lots of examples in different cities where Congress people have written letters against or in support of privatization measures, and HUD has seriously taken those into consideration. So when we recognized, hey, our mayor's not going to do anything, none of the state reps are going to do anything, city council's not going to do anything, let's appeal to Ilhan, like, she didn't do anything either. You know, we've been appealing her since March, and now CD5 has written a letter to her asking her to stop the privatization of public housing here, and she still hasn't done anything. So, I mean, I think it's cool that she wants to improve public housing on this large scale, but she needs to start at home.
Absolutely.
There are people that are in her district right now that are about to lose their housing. And she can stop it.
Agreed. So, hey, if you're listening to this, anybody who knows Ilhan, you know, step up to the plate. We really need this right now. This is like a crisis in our city. So on top of the RAD program being pushed aggressively,
Yeah.
and Section 18 being pushed aggressively. My understanding is also that MPHA is raising rents for tenants as well.
Yeah, I didn't bring my I didn't bring my notes on that, but basically in December 13th, which is this week, MPHA is voting whether or not to raise rents. So basically what they're going to do, and I'm just going to explain this super briefly, is that there is something called flat rate rent that some residents who are like working class but aren't middle class but are working class, you know what I mean, who are making more money than the very poorest residents but are making money, pay, which is a percentage of area median income, you know?
Yep.
And so what they want to do is they want to raise those rents. And so they want to say, hey, if you're making this much money, then you really need to either pay this much or move out. But that's not what public housing should be doing, you know what I mean? If you are a working class family that is making a little bit more money but wanting to save to buy a house or wanting to save to buy a car or do whatever, or just wanting to save, right? You shouldn't have to pay more rent than you have to.
Absolutely.
Right? So it's basically an attack on people that are on the borderline. And I think it's really horrible because it means that like public housing is like super antagonistic towards people that are like just working class.
Yeah.
It's not a good idea.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
You know, recently, on top of all this that we're talking about, there was a heartbreaking and tragic fire not too far from where we're sitting right now in the Cedar high-rises public housing in the West Bank of Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the circumstances that led to that fire and what people are going through now and what that says about kind of like the priorities and values at the city and MPHA?
Yeah, I first want to say that like it's horrible what happened. It's really heartbreaking. You know, I'm praying for all of the families and everything.
Absolutely.
And it really sucks because like not but a year ago, these high-rises got an $825,000 upgrade from the city of Minneapolis through MPHA that was supported and publicized heavily by Mayor Jacob Frey and Abdi Warsame. But this upgrade didn't have a sprinkler system. It didn't have any other things that might have prevented the fire. Instead, this upgrade had a security fence and 17 new cameras and other security guards and lots of new measures. So I think that really speaks to the priorities of the city when it comes to public housing residents. They didn't invest in the building and say, hey, these are really high, dense buildings that could use sprinkler systems. They said, hey, instead of retrofitting these buildings with sprinkler systems, we're going to sort of, instead of protecting the people that are inside, we're going to protect people from the outside. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And it's just the same ideas. It seems like you have people in charge of a public housing authority that don't really love poor people or don't care about poor people and have a capitalist ideology. And yeah, the idea that you'd put a security fence up when the building doesn't have a sprinkler system is just, it's maddening. Yeah,
and it's really horrible too because MPHA, I think, should be held accountable for this because, like, okay, yeah, MPHA's answer to this fire was that they didn't need to have this sprinkler system by code. My response to that is, like, MPHA has put in, like I said, a security upgrade last year. They've put in a lot of new things to all of their buildings, you know what I mean? They have money that they're sitting on. They often say that they don't have money, but they're sitting on a $23 million surplus. They got an increase from the Congress last year through the 2018 omnibus bill. So they have money. MPHA has responsibility to provide safe and secure housing to all of their residents. And it's really frustrating for me because you see, I feel like the only elected official that called MPHA out was Angela Conley and said, we need an investigation. Everybody else was like, oh, this is so horrible. This is why we need, I saw Lisa Bender tweet, this is why we need a robust investment in public housing. Well, girl, you signed a letter supporting the privatization of public housing. If you wanted an investment in public housing, you can make that happen because you're sitting on the housing council and you're the president of the city council.
Absolutely.
So it's like really frustrating to me, like people, there's so much like political just like BS that is just moving around, but like people actually died. So if this doesn't, like nobody needed to die, you know what I mean? So if this doesn't speak to the incompetence of MPHA's leadership and to our city council, then like I don't know what will.
Absolutely,
you know?
Absolutely. So I'm curious to know if you're willing to share a bit. You're a young leader, an artist, you're a student who's taken on this organizing work while your housing is under threat. How's it impacting you? You know, what's it like for your heart and for your spirit and for your health and just for your whole being, like being engaged in this struggle where you are right now in your life?
Yeah, I think there have been definite moments in the last 4 or 5 years where it's been very stressful for me, where we ended up making it through, where we ended up pushing through and like preventing the thing or engaging the thing or doing whatever. But I don't know. I think a lot of people don't know this about me, but like prior to living in public housing, me and my mom were homeless for a little bit. And if public housing, like if Glendale, because MPHA actually released earlier this year that they have intentions to pursue RAD again at Glendale in 2020, you know, if that happens, then, you know, I might be homeless again. So it's very imminent for me. It feels very immediate. It's very scary, but also in a way, because I've been doing it for so long and I started when I was like 14, I'm a bit desensitized to it. I'm just like, I have to push through, I have to make it happen. You know, there's other people that are more vulnerable than me. I think about like the elders at Elliott Twins, or some of the larger families and these scattered site homes that are more vulnerable than I am, you know, and I'm just like, okay, I just have to do my best to support them. It's just kind of scary. I think for me, the biggest part of it is it's like doing this organizing has been consuming in a way that I didn't anticipate when I started, because when I started, I was just doing it for volunteer hours. I was like a kid, right?
Yeah.
And like 4 years later, I'm still young, but like I'm not a kid anymore. I'm like in college and this is still my main work. And I always thought, you know, I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to do art. Like organizing is just like this thing that I'm doing because I have to do it. It's out of necessity. It's not something I really want to do. But I've grown to really love it and respect it in a lot of ways. And it's not just like the thing that I do now, it's like a passion of mine. And it also, something that you told me a couple years ago actually really resonated with me. I remember we were having this meeting and you were like, oh, Kahaa, you know, like organizing is like the art, but the canvas is the world or something. And I thought that was kind of silly when I first heard it, but like now, like all these years later, I'm like, okay, so I want to do all these different art projects, but like the same tools that I'm using to organize, like engaging people, learning how to reach people, learning how to speak to people are like the same tools that you need, the same skills that you need in like art making, right?
Yeah.
So I felt like this work has like been hard and difficult and scary, but also it's given me a new toughness and it's given me a lot of new skills that I can use everywhere. People think I'm very impressive because I know how to use big housing words. Like it's a mixed bag, but I'm happy to have been doing it.
That's real. That's really real. Wow. Yeah, I guess like I just really respect that. And, you know, I've known you as a performer and you're a gifted poet and a gifted performer. And then to see you MC the public meeting a couple weeks ago at North, where you're using those skills of oration and being able to capture audience's attention to do this important work is like, it's really incredible. And I've seen people open up, you know, people were in tears in that room because they were being seen. They were sharing their stories of you know, struggling to hold on to their housing. So again, I just want to really express my respect for you and for your mother and for the whole campaign and all the different folks who have shown up over the years to support. It's really impressive. And I hope for you and wish for you that you'll be able to have some time in your life where you can pursue your creativity.
Oh, no, I'm doing that now.
Nice.
I'm doing that now. No, I think at first I was like, no, I'm busy doing this, but now I'm less impatient and things have opened up.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Hell yeah. So I got like 1 or 2 questions. I'm thinking, you know, folks listening are getting a sense of like the really intense pressure that public housing residents and public housing in Minneapolis is facing. How can folks join the fight to preserve public housing, and how can folks stand in solidarity with Defend Glendale and the Keep Public Housing Public Coalition?
So I think the first thing is just like vote everybody out. Right? Like public housing is a public good, it's a need, especially when we're having this massive housing crisis. Something that I didn't mention earlier is that because MPHA is an MTW agency, because it's been deregulated, it has an exemption under the fair class limit. And so the fair class limit is this thing that was passed by Bill Clinton in the 90s saying that public housing authorities can't build new public housing unless to replace old units. But MPHA is an exemption to that. So because we have money, if there was political will, like the city of Minneapolis could build more public housing.
And that's what we need.
And that's what we need.
Absolutely.
So like we're one of the few agencies, we're one of like 40 agencies in the country that has the ability to build new public housing, and we should be doing that.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I think we need to get rid of leaders who think of public housing as like something that needs to be privatized, and we need to get in leaders who think of public housing as something that needs to be expanded.
Hell
like
yeah.
That's the first thing. I think people need to call their city councilors, call their state reps, call Jacob Fry, like annoy the hell out of them and tell them, hey, we need this. And also like put pressure on Enhan and say, yo, like Enhan, like please, like you obviously love public housing, so come and show that love in your city. And then also, I was just going to say something else about the fire that I kind of forgot, but like residents still haven't been rehoused yet from the fire. It's been over a week since it's happened, and there's lots of elders who aren't able to stay in their homes because of like smoke issues and fumes and like bad conditions, but MPHA has refused to rehouse them, so they're couch hopping. Like very old people and disabled folks are couch hopping because MPHA has refused to rehouse them. So like call MPHA and say, what are you doing? You know what I mean?
Really?
What are you doing?
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, public housing is great. We need more of it. Public housing, I believe, is the end-all be-all solution to homelessness.
Amen.
And like if you're anti-homelessness, you need to support public housing wherever you are. In Minneapolis, if you're in St. Paul, St. Paul Public Housing Authority is actually planning to do RAD to 8 of their properties as well, but our organization just doesn't have the capacity to do 2 cities at once.
Yeah.
So if you live in St. Paul, like call your city councilors, call the mayor and say, yo, what are you doing with RAD? Or RAD, only 1 out of 5 people are able to come back. We need to stop this, you know? If you're outside of the Twin Cities, all of this is happening everywhere.
Yeah.
Section 18 is being used in lots of mid-sized cities like Minneapolis to get rid of public housing, same as RAD, and this is an epidemic. So
Absolutely.
Wherever you are, there's action that you can take to stop it and support poor people where you live.
Hey, real shit. Hey, you heard it here. 2021 Minneapolis, we need serious commitment to public housing. It's just like it's the answer to homelessness, it's the answer to gentrification. We can't keep giving public land to private developers and commodifying housing as a human right. It should be built in the public sector. It should be affordable. We shouldn't have people sleeping on the streets. And I just give thanks for the work of folks like Kahaa and the Defend Glendale, Keep Public Housing, Public Coalition. Thank you so much for sitting down with us. Huge salute and respect to you.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Hell yeah. Money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land, solidarity. If you're funny, stand very far away from me. We have running plans about as far as they can see to keep them coming. Bands building up the company. Shauna told me I was gonna be prosperous. I listen. I'm just praying, make a place a positive addition. Try to knock me off my spot would be preposterous. Y'all fishing in this bitch, illuminate like phosphorus. I glisten. Gliding like a Christ on the water, now you're christened. Sliding like I'm ice over top the opposition. Hold a vision in my mind and make it pop about fruition. Expanding these demands and will not crop the propositions. Show the whole food, guaranteed the whole mood. The rest, you're gonna inherit the earth that holds true. Culture power grows, gonna deal them a few blows. The elders transcended the spirit, the youth grows.